Ethan Parker sat on his couch at home, holding a glass of water, but he didn't even notice when it spilled through his fingers. His eyes were fixed on some random spot on the wall, and his mind spun with a whirlwind of disorganized thoughts. The weight of failure was crushing. The job he had built through hard work, the countless nights he spent finishing projects, the stressful meetings, the last-minute trips to close deals, all of it collapsed with one sentence from his boss: "The company is going in another direction. We need to cut costs." But Ethan knew that was a lie. Something was off about that firing. He wasn't just any employee. He was one of the company's best project managers, always praised for meeting impossible deadlines and turning crises into opportunities. It made no sense to be discarded like that. But reality was cruel. No matter how dedicated he was still unemployed, with no backup plan. The following days were a blur. He tried to stay calm, send out resumes, reach out to old contacts. But with every ignored email and every cold reply from a recruiter, his despair grew. The rent on the house he shared with Rachel was still paid up for now, but for how long? His savings were running low. And to make things worse, his wife was acting strangely. Rachel was no longer the caring, attentive woman he knew. They used to laugh together, talk through their problems, plan the future. Now she was distant. One-word answers, a lost look in her eyes, her phone always in her hand. She got irritated over the smallest things, avoided deep conversations, and most oddly, started going out frequently, always on Friday nights. At first, Ethan tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just stress. He didn't want to assume the worst. But then came the hollow excuses. "I'm going out with some girls from work, you understand, right?" Like, she'd say, tossing her hair to the side while grabbing her car keys. But Ethan had never met these friends. He'd never seen them in person. And what was even stranger was that Rachel would come home late at night, smelling different, a hint of a men's cologne mixed with a touch of whiskey. One day, while he was washing dishes, he saw Rachel on the couch, typing on her phone with a faint smile. A smile he hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't jealousy that tore him up in that moment. It was the certainty that something was very wrong. He knew that sparkle in her eyes wasn't for him. In the days that followed, Ethan started paying more attention. Small details he'd once overlooked began fitting together like a painful puzzle. Rachel started turning off her phone whenever he walked into the room. She changed her lock screen password. Friday nights, once spent watching movies and drinking wine with him, became an unexplainable, non-negotiable appointment. The worst blow came when he accidentally saw a bank statement. An expensive dinner paid for at a restaurant he'd never set foot in. Ethan's heart sank. That night, lying next to her in bed and pretending to be asleep, his mind raced. He could smell the faint trace of a new fragrance on her pillow, definitely not the one she wore when she left the house. He rolled onto his side, trying to contain his anger, trying to understand how his life had come to this point. But he knew he couldn't act without proof. If he was right, if Rachel really was cheating on him, he needed to find out the truth. And above all, he needed to know why it was happening. In the darkness of the bedroom, Ethan opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. For the first time, he made a definitive decision. He would find out everything. Ethan spent the next morning like a ghost in his own house. Every move Rachel made, every time she avoided his gaze, every muffled laugh while on her phone seemed to scream that something bigger was going on. But he couldn't just accuse her. Not without evidence. That's when he decided to act. If there was one thing he'd learned from years of managing projects, it was that any mystery could be solved with data and observation. Planning, strategy, execution. That was exactly how he approached this. The opportunity came that same night. Rachel went into the bathroom, turned on the shower, and, as usual, spent a good amount of time in there. It was one of the few habits she kept, and Ethan knew that gave him enough of a window. He moved fast. He grabbed a small case he'd bought that afternoon, opened it with precision, and took out the devices carefully. First, the GPS tracker. He went to the garage and secured it on the inside of her car's fender. Small, discreet, impossible to notice. Then the microphone. He hid it under the dashboard, well camouflaged among the electrical wires. The finishing touch was a camera, strategically placed near the passenger seat, almost undetectable. Everything was ready. Everything was set up. Now he'd have eyes and ears where it mattered. When he went back inside, the shower was still running. He took a deep breath and stored the case in the back of his office drawer. When Rachel came out of the bathroom, drying her hair, Ethan was already sitting on the couch, pretending to watch TV, as if nothing had happened. Friday arrived. Rachel got ready like usual. She put on a black dress Ethan hadn't seen her wear in a while, sprayed on a different perfume, and applied a bold red lipstick. When she looked at him, she gave him a flat smile. "Don't wait up for me. I'm going out with the girls from work." She grabbed her purse, her keys, and left. Ethan waited just a minute before picking up his phone and opening the GPS app. The little blue dot was moving through the city map. He tapped on the microphone and turned up the volume in his headphones. At first, there was only the sound of the engine and faint music. Then something unexpected happened. The car stopped. She wasn't headed to a restaurant or a bar. It wasn't some fancy spot downtown. It was a distant parking lot near a park. A discreet place. Then the passenger door opened. A man got in. The camera caught everything. The image was clear enough for Ethan to see who it was. And his heart froze. Mark Harrison. His ex-boss. "You're late," Rachel said, adjusting her hair. "Traffic was a nightmare," Mark answered. Ethan gritted his teeth, feeling his stomach churn. Rachel smiled and held Mark's hand for a few seconds. "He doesn't suspect a thing?" Mark asked, glancing around to make sure no one was nearby. "Nothing. He's so lost in that job mess that he doesn't even realize I'm halfway out the door." Ethan tasted bitterness in his mouth. "We need to do this right," Mark went on. "If you ask for a divorce now, he might try to fight it. But if we wait a little longer, he'll take whatever you throw at him. He has no options, Rachel. No job, no money, he'll sign anything." "I know. I'm just waiting for the right moment." Silence. Ethan didn't blink. He wanted to believe this wasn't real, but the images and the voices in his headphones proved otherwise. Rachel wasn't just cheating on him. She was planning his downfall. Mark sighed and ran his hand across the car's dashboard, thinking, "Once we settle this, we'll be together. And with half of everything he has." Rachel laughed, satisfied. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. His heart was pounding, but it was no longer desperation. It was anger. A cold hit of reality right to his face. They thought they had it all under control. They thought he was an easy target. But Ethan had just turned the tables. He didn't sleep that night. Every word said in that car played over and over in his mind like a never-ending nightmare. Rachel and Mark were playing with his life, his dignity, his stability. They planned to leave him with nothing while they moved on together, triumphant, as if he was just a disposable obstacle. But they made a mistake. They underestimated him. The next morning, Ethan knew he couldn't act on impulse. He needed a plan as careful as theirs. And the missing piece to turn the tide was someone who had as much to lose as he did, Victoria Harrison. Victoria had always been a discreet woman, elegant, reserved, the kind of person who stayed in complete control. Ethan barely knew her, but he knew she was the daughter of Thomas Caldwell, a magnate who built an empire and never fully approved of his daughter's marriage to Mark. Ethan spent the entire day gathering everything. He chose the most damning parts of the recording, organized the evidence, and, heart-pounding, sent Victoria a direct message. "I need to talk to you. It's serious. About Mark, about cheating." She replied with just 2 words, where and when. They met that same afternoon at a quiet cafe. When Victoria arrived, wearing a flawless beige coat and dark sunglasses, Ethan noticed that despite her calm appearance, her eyes held a certain restlessness. "Just say it," she said bluntly. He took out his phone, slid it across the table, and hit play. In the first few seconds, Victoria showed no reaction. But as the conversation in the car went on, her eyes narrowed. When Rachel held Mark's hand and they both laughed about how Ethan didn't suspect a thing, a muscle in Victoria's jaw twitched. Then came the final part, the kiss. The silence that followed was almost tangible. Ethan, speaking firmly, broke the tension. "He fired me. And as if that wasn't enough, he's sleeping with my wife. But it's more than that, Victoria. He wants to destroy me. He wants to leave me with nothing." Victoria didn't take her eyes off the phone, as if she needed to absorb everything. Then, slowly, she placed it on the table and folded her arms. "I've heard my husband talk about you," she began, her voice soft but carrying a dangerous edge. "He said you were competent but arrogant. That you thought you were better than him." Ethan swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "I never paid much attention," she went on, ignoring his reaction. "Mark always managed the company. He always did what he thought was best, or at least that's what he made me believe. But now it's different." She looked up at him, and this time her expression was cold and calculating. "He's cheating on me." Those words left her mouth without hesitation, without trembling. Like she was just stating a fact. But Ethan sensed something deeper beneath the impenetrable mask. "Before we got married, my father forced me to include a clause in our prenup," she explained. "If Mark cheated on me, he'd lose everything. Every cent. Every share of the company. He'd walk away with nothing." So, with this evidence, including the image of them kissing in the car, Victoria interrupted with an icy smile, "It's pretty strong proof. And I'm going to use it." She picked up the phone again, staring at it for a few moments before standing up. "Thanks for showing me this, Ethan," she said firmly. "Now let me take care of the rest." Without waiting for a response, she left the cafe with determined steps. Ethan stayed there for a moment, watching her disappear through the door, fully aware that Mark Harrison had no idea of the storm heading his way. The next few days were far too quiet. Mark suspected nothing. Rachel kept up her well-rehearsed lies, acting untouchable, and Ethan stayed calm, patiently waiting for the inevitable fallout. He had learned one thing throughout this ordeal: when predators feel threatened, they attack. And that's exactly what happened. One ordinary afternoon, while Ethan was sorting through some papers on his kitchen table, his phone buzzed. "Unknown number." He answered. "Mr. Parker? This is Detective Collins from the local precinct. We need you to come down here immediately." His heart raced. He hadn't done anything wrong. So why was a detective calling him? When he got to the station, they took him to a small room with a metal table in the middle and a mirror he knew was for observation. Detective Collins, a man with a stern expression and probing eyes, threw a file on the table and crossed his arms. "Do you know why you're here, Mr. Parker?" Ethan kept his composure. "I have no idea." Collins opened the file and slid some photos toward him. The shock hit Ethan like a punch in the gut. They were pictures of Rachel, a bruise on her cheek, tears running down her face. "Your wife filed a report against you," Collins said, studying Ethan's every reaction. "She claims you assaulted her last night." For a second, Ethan almost laughed. But anger replaced that impulse immediately. "Rachel's lying," he said firmly. Collins raised an eyebrow. "Every suspect says the same." Ethan took a deep breath. He had to stay calm. "I can prove it." Collins folded his arms. "How?" Ethan pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. "I have recordings. She and Mark plotted against me. It's all documented." Collins picked up the device and skimmed through the files. The tension in the room shifted. "Stay here," the detective said, leaving with the phone. Ethan waited alone for a long few minutes, adrenaline coursing through him. Rachel really thought she could bring him down that easily? She thought he would just lie down and let her destroy him? The door opened, and Collins came back with a different look on his face. "Mr. Parker," he said more gently this time, "it seems your wife and Mr. Harrison have a lot to answer for." Ethan exhaled slowly. "You know what to do, then. We're working on a warrant. In the meantime, I suggest you stay away from her." Ethan nodded. He didn't need to do anything else. Fate itself was closing in on Rachel and Mark. And the best part? The truth was winning. Ethan left the precinct feeling both relief and anticipation. He knew that Rachel and Mark thought they had it in the bag. But now the tide was turning. Wasting no time, he grabbed his phone and called Victoria. She answered on the second ring. "Any news?" she asked, cold and firm. "A lot," Ethan said bluntly. "Rachel just falsely accused me of assault. But I proved she was lying. The police are already on their trail." There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. "Then it's time." Ethan knew exactly what she meant. Meanwhile, Mark and Rachel were together in a hotel room. It was a discreet place, chosen for times when they needed to talk about their plans without taking risks. Rachel was sitting on the bed, legs crossed, sipping wine. "He's probably at the police station right now, trying to explain himself," she said with a smug smile. "Like I said, you just push him a little and he'll fall apart," Mark replied, leaning back against the headboard. "Now it's just a matter of time until he agrees to the divorce on our terms." Rachel laughed, swirling the wine in her glass. But before she could say anything else, Mark's phone rang. He looked at the screen and frowned. "It's Victoria's lawyer," he muttered, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Pick it up," Rachel said, curious. He slid his finger across the screen and put the phone to his ear. "Yes?" On the other end, the lawyer's voice was steady. "Good evening, Mr. Harrison. We need to talk." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "Right now?" "Yes." "Can you speak freely?" He glanced at Rachel before answering. "Sure, what's this about?" The lawyer cleared his throat. "I have a series of recordings showing you cheating on your wife and conspiring against Ethan Parker. These include footage of you in a car, kissing another woman." Mark's blood went cold. "What? Where did you get that?" The lawyer ignored his outburst. "When you married Ms. Caldwell, you agreed to a clause in the prenup stating that if you committed adultery, you'd lose all rights to the marital estate. Therefore, you are officially removed from the company, effective immediately." Mark felt the ground drop from under him. "This is insane." "No, Mr. Harrison, it's a legally binding document you signed. You no longer have any rights to the company's shares, you can't use any vehicles registered under the company's name, and you are barred from entering its premises." "What?" "Security has already been instructed not to let you into the building or the residence you currently occupy." Panic seized Mark. He got up from the bed abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "This is absurd. I'll fix this." "Feel free to try," the lawyer replied, sounding almost bored. "But legally, there's nothing you can do." Mark ended the call and threw his phone against the wall. "What happened?" Rachel asked, alarmed. He looked at her, still trying to process everything. "I lost it all." Rachel's eyes went wide. "What do you mean?" "Victoria, she got me." Rachel felt her heart pounding. But before she could say anything, her own phone rang. She looked at the screen, unknown number. "Hello? Mrs. Parker? This is the police station. We need you to come in immediately for questioning." She swallowed hard. "What about?" "It's better if we talk in person." "Is Mr. Mark Harrison with you?" She hesitated. "Yes, great. He needs to come in too." Rachel looked at Mark, who was pale and still in shock. "We need to go to the station," she muttered. His expression darkened. He grabbed his phone and quickly dialed his lawyer. When the man picked up, Mark burst out, "I need you now. The station says we have to come in," and Mr. Harrison, the lawyer, cut him off bluntly. "I work for the company. Not for you." Silence filled the air. "I heard about your dismissal," he continued. "From this moment on, I can't represent you anymore." Mark gripped the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "You can't just abandon me." "It's just business, Mr. Harrison." The call ended. Rachel felt a lump form in her throat. "Mark, now what?" He looked at her, completely lost. For the first time, they were both cornered. When they arrived at the police station, the place felt cold and impersonal. Rachel and Mark were met by two officers who showed no sympathy whatsoever. Mark Harrison and Rachel Parker, asked one of the officers. "Yes," Rachel answered, hesitant. The officers exchanged a look before continuing. "Mr. Mark Harrison and Mrs. Rachel Parker, you are both under arrest for filing a false report, attempting to commit procedural fraud, and conspiring against Ethan Parker." Rachel stepped back, feeling like she couldn't breathe. "What?" "You have the right to remain silent," the officer said as another officer moved in with handcuffs. "This is a mistake." Mark protested, but didn't have time to argue. The cuffs snapped tightly around his wrists. Rachel started crying. "No. Wait. I can explain." It was too late. They were taken inside the station, while Ethan, watching from outside, felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. They had played dirty. They had tried to destroy him. But in the end, they were swallowed by their own poison. The chaos was over. A few days later, Ethan was called in for a meeting with Victoria. She was now officially in charge of the company and, as no surprise to anyone, offered him an important position. "I need someone I can trust," she said, giving him a slight smile. Ethan didn't hesitate. "I'm in." Time went by, and what began as a simple alliance against a common enemy turned into something more. Victoria and Ethan, both betrayed and seeking justice, grew closer in a natural way, first as business partners, then as something beyond that. In the end, the truth prevailed. The betrayal had its consequences. And Ethan, once knocked down and humiliated, found not only justice but also a new beginning, this time with someone who truly appreciated him. Here is the continuation of the story that had been split into two detailed sections, featuring the twists leading to the climax and the surprising ending, now included naturally in the text without any titles or numbering. Ethan left the police station feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation. He knew Rachel and Mark thought they had won, but now the tide was turning. Without wasting any time, he grabbed his phone and called Victoria. She answered on the second ring. "Any news?" she asked, sounding cold and firm. "A lot," Ethan said directly. "Rachel just filed a false assault charge against me, but I proved it was a lie. The police are already on to her and Mark." Victoria was quiet for a few seconds. "Then it's time." Ethan knew exactly what that meant. Meanwhile, Mark and Rachel were together in a discreet hotel room where they met to discuss their plans without taking risks. Rachel was perched on the bed, legs crossed, taking a sip of wine. "He's probably at the station right now, trying to explain himself," she said, pleased. "Like I said, just push him a little and he'll collapse," Mark replied, settling back against the headboard. "Now it's only a matter of time until he agrees to the divorce on our terms." Rachel laughed, gently swishing her wine. Before she could say anything else, Mark's phone rang. He checked the screen, his forehead creasing. "It's Victoria's lawyer," he muttered, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Answer it," Rachel said, curious. Mark swiped to take the call and pressed the phone to his ear. "Yes?" The lawyer's voice on the other end was unyielding. "Good evening, Mr. Harrison. We need to talk." Mark felt a chill run through him. "Right now?" "Yes." "Are you free to speak?" He glanced at Rachel before answering. Sure, what happened? The lawyer cleared his throat. I have evidence showing you cheating on your wife and conspiring against Ethan Parker, including recordings of you in a car kissing another woman. Mark's blood ran cold. What? How did you get that? The lawyer didn't address his question. When you married Ms. Caldwell, you signed a prenup that states if you're unfaithful, you forfeit everything. That means you're immediately dismissed from the company. Mark felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. This is insane. No, Mr. Harrison, it's a legally binding agreement. You no longer hold rights to the company shares, you can't use any company vehicles, and you're banned from entering corporate property. What? Security has already been informed not to let you into the building or the home you currently occupy. Panic seized Mark, and he jumped from the bed, running his hands through his hair. This is ridiculous. I'll fix it. Go ahead and try, the lawyer replied, almost sounding bored. But from a legal standpoint, there's nothing you can do. Mark ended the call with a violent tap and hurled his phone at the wall. What happened? Rachel asked, terrified. He looked at her, still in disbelief. I lost everything. Rachel's eyes widened. What do you mean? Victoria, she caught me. Rachel's heart pounded. But before she could react, her own phone rang. She glanced at the screen, unknown number. Hello? Mrs. Parker? This is the station calling. We need you to come in right away for questioning. She swallowed hard. Questioning about what? It's better if we talk in person. Is Mr. Mark Harrison with you? She paused. Yes, perfect. He needs to come in, too. Rachel looked at Mark, who was pale and shaken. We have to go to the station, she murmured. His gaze grew darker. He grabbed his phone and rapidly called his lawyer. When the man answered, Mark exploded, I need you. They're telling me to come in, and, Mr. Harrison, the lawyer interrupted firmly. I work for the company. Not for you anymore. Silence filled the room. I know you were let go, he continued. And I can't represent you now. Mark's grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles going white. You can't just leave me hanging. It's just business, Mr. Harrison. The call ended. Rachel felt a knot forming in her stomach. Mark, what do we do now? He looked at her, totally lost. For the first time, they had no escape. When they arrived at the police station, everything felt cold and impersonal. They were greeted by two officers who showed no sympathy. Mark Harrison and Rachel Parker asked one of them. Yes, Rachel replied uneasily. The officers exchanged glances. Mr. Mark Harrison and Mrs. Rachel Parker, you're both under arrest for filing a false report, attempting to commit fraud, and conspiring against Ethan Parker. Rachel stepped back, struggling to breathe. What? You have the right to remain silent, continued the officer, as another came forward with handcuffs. This is all a mistake. Mark yelled, but there was no time to argue as he felt the metal close around his wrists. Rachel started crying.